Come on in, you guys, for another episode of the Livin' La Vida Low Carb Show with Jimmy Moore. And today, it is Tuesday, and as always on Tuesdays, I try to bring you guys here on the show from time to time brand new studies that are important as related to ketogenic diets, to fasting, carnivore, anything that would be of interest to this audience when it comes to nutritional health. Well, today, I have another study all ready to go to tell you about that is not pro-keto, it is not pro-fasting or pro-low carb. It's actually trying to make the argument for conventional wisdom when it comes to health. And so wanted to tell you about this study, so why don't we just dive right in. It was published in the January 2021 issue of the journal called Obesity Journal, and the title of the study, Does Lifestyle Intervention Improve Health of Adults with Overweight and Obesity and Type 2 Diabetes? And it's the findings from the Look Ahead randomized trial. So we're going to get all into this Look Ahead research group and what they were trying to accomplish and then what they did find in the study. So to go along with this study, they have a study importance little box here in the study paper. So let me read from that. What is already known? Intensive lifestyle interventions focused on weight loss have beneficial short-term effects on health of older adults with overweight, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. So they already know that from previous research. The Action for Health in Diabetes, they're calling that Look Ahead, it's an acronym. Trial is a randomized trial compared with control that evaluates the long-term effects of lifestyle intervention in 5,145 study participants. So this new study, what it adds is it's a review that summarizes the history of the trial, and it presents the findings related to a wide range of health outcomes. So you'll hear a lot of what's called primary outcomes, and then there will be other secondary outcomes as well. So how might these results change the direction of research or the focus of clinical practice? They say here in the little box, the review shows that many different health outcomes were improved by lifestyle intervention. We'll get to that in just a minute, especially during the early years of the intervention, but several important outcomes such as cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, cancer, and cognition did not show significant differences between the intervention group and the control group. And frailty fractures occurred more often in the intervention group than the control. Post hoc analyses suggest the possibility that this type of intervention may be beneficial to some, but potentially harmful to others. Oh man, I love it when the researchers have to admit, dang it, it's not all good news. And in this case, pushing for low-calorie, low-fat diets, they have to admit in the paper actually causes harm to some people. And I wish when they would talk about this within the conventional setting, they would admit at least, okay, low-fat, low-calorie, it'll work for a certain segment of the population, but some people actually get much worse than that. And to me, if you're a good researcher, you want to dig into that a little more. What is it about those people who do not respond well that makes it harmful? That would be an interesting study. All right, so let's take a look at the beginning of the paper. This paper reviews all the main findings from the Action for Health in Diabetes Look Ahead trial, a randomized trial testing the long-term health effects of intensive lifestyle interventions in 5,145 persons with overweight, obesity, as well as type 2 diabetes. Although the primary outcomes originally focused on cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, secondary outcomes include a broad range of health parameters related to diabetes and obesity. Oh, did you catch that? Well, originally our focus of the outcomes was just going to be on cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, but we didn't find any improvement there, so we have to scramble now and figure out other things so we can show some benefit, so we keep getting funding for our research. That's exactly what happened, you guys. And it's gross that if your primary outcome originally in the study was to look at cardiovascular health parameters and markers, You should have stuck with that. We'll get into it in a minute. As the cohort went along, the study outcomes were expanded to include health problems affecting geriatric populations, things like cognitive impairment and disability. This review summarizes the history of this trial and presents the findings related to a wide range of health outcomes. Studies are reviewed that showed positive impact of this intervention on diabetes control and complications, depression, physical health-related quality of life, sleep apnea, incontinence, brain structure, and healthcare use and costs. Several composite indices were also positively impacted, including multi-morbidity, geriatric syndromes, disability-free life years, and more. However, there are also some important outcomes that did not show significant differences between the intervention and the control group. Things like the original primary marker, cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, as well as cancer, cognitive function, and cognitive impairment. For several of these non-significant effects, post hoc analyses suggested that there may be differences amongst subgroups, raising the possibility that the intervention may be beneficial to some but potentially harmful to others. The only adverse effects of this intervention relative to diabetes support and education were on the frailty fractures and the related negative effects on body composition and bone density. Through this review, the manuscript seeks to determine whether weight loss should be encouraged in this population, given the large number of beneficial effects relative to the small number of adverse ones. The answer appears to be yes. They always say that. In fact, most of the benefits that they convey with conventional wisdom when it comes to nutrition and diabetes is the weight loss alone is what's going to give you the benefits. Now, you and I know from my many years of teaching you about low-carb diets, it's more than that. But they always kind of say, lose weight and you'll control your diabetes. That's not how it works, but there are definitely benefits that happen from weight loss. So guys, I just want to let you know, this is part of a show I do on Instagram called Jimmy Makes Science Simple. If you have not signed up to be a part of when I do brand new episodes of Jimmy Makes Science Simple over on Instagram, go follow me on there. It's at Jimmy Makes Science Simple. And this is an original one that has not aired yet until it's on my podcast. It is currently in video form on Jimmy Makes Science Simple over on Instagram as well as on YouTube. All right, let's get into the introduction to the study. Given the epidemic of obesity and increasing prevalence of type 2 diabetes, an important question is whether weight loss should be emphasized as part of a treatment regimen for individuals with these conditions. Findings from the Action for Health and Diabetes, called the Look Ahead trial, which observed no significant effects of a lifestyle weight loss intervention on cardiovascular disease, mortality, or morbidity in such individuals, raises questions regarding how strongly healthcare professionals should encourage adults with type 2 diabetes to lose weight. In addition, as look-ahead follow-up continued over time, the outcomes of interest gradually became those of greater relevance to those in older populations with diabetes, things like geriatric syndromes, cognition, and disability. So the goal of this paper is to discuss the history of the Look Ahead study, the areas in which intervention lifestyle or intensive lifestyle intervention did and did not improve outcomes, and issues related to whether this intervention is beneficial to some but harmful to others. By reviewing these findings, we will look to answer the question of whether weight loss needs to be encouraged in this population. So the original impetus for the Look Ahead study came from observational studies that showed weight loss in older adults might have adverse effects on all-cause mortality. Observational studies that try to distinguish intentional from unintentional weight loss in older adults has led to the hypothesis that the negative effects of weight loss resulted from unintentional weight loss, usually associated with things like chronic illness, whereas voluntary weight loss tended to have positive effects. So people that have cancer and go through treatment for that, there is a weight loss associated, but it's a negative weight loss. Whereas they're saying if you're proactive about wanting to lose weight, that's what's going to incur the positive effect. A randomized trial was suggested as the best way to distinguish voluntary versus involuntary weight loss. The decision to address this question within individuals with diabetes was based on the growing prevalence of this population and on their elevating risk of developing cardiovascular disease. Now, you guys know, because I've repeated it ad nauseum in all of these Jimmy Makes Science Simple videos, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, even cancer, obesity, they're all in the same spectrum of the exact same disease. It's the disease of insulin resistance. If you haven't figured that out by now, and you can't see in these studies how clearly tied all of these things are, Alzheimer's disease is also a part of that, PCOS, we could go down the list of all the manifestations of insulin resistance. And that's what it is. I wish they would actually get to the heart of that rather than teasing out type 2 diabetes and, oh, there's an association with the type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular risk. No, it's the same disease. Let's stop dancing around that. So the Look Ahead study ran from 2002 to 2012. It was funded as a 2-armed randomized controlled trial comparing the intervention group with a control group given diabetes support and education. The primary outcome was a composite which included death from cardiovascular causes, non-fatal myocardial infarction, that's a heart attack, non-fatal stroke, and hospitalized angina, which is chest pain. The goal of the intervention was to produce a 7% weight loss through calorie restriction. So this is the intensive intervention they did. Calorie restriction along with increased physical activity. Eat less, move more? Is that what Look Ahead is looking at? You bet it is. Which is going to make the findings we have here in a minute all the more laughable. That this is what they promote heavily to the population. And watch what happens when they did this. They wanted to produce significantly greater improvements in cardiovascular fitness than that in the control group. The study successfully achieved these goals. Did they? We'll find out in a minute. In 2012, the intervention phase of Look Ahead was stopped for futility because it's so funny when they say, oh, we reached our goals, but watch this. Because there was no differences between the two groups when it came to primary and secondary outcomes for heart disease, cardiovascular disease. At that point, the trial was converted into a post-intervention observational phase. In other words, all the data up to that point just came to a screeching halt. It was no longer a randomized controlled trial. They're like, we're not showing any difference between the control group and the intervention group, where we were making the hypothesis that this intervention of losing weight by eating less and moving more was going to provide benefit, and they got a whole lot of nutting when it came to the primary outcome when it related to their cardiovascular disease. Is that not funny? Like, if the whole point of the study was to show that calorie restriction and exercising more was supposed to provide a benefit to weight loss, which by extension of that would benefit the cardiovascular disease, and they did not see any difference between that group and the control group, they had egg on their face, guys. And now they want to brag about how it was so successful. No, it was not. It was an abysmal failure. And yet it's heralded, the Look Ahead study, heralded as proof that we need to be getting people to eat less and move more in order to improve their cardiovascular health. You know better now. Although the intervention phase was still ongoing, 2 ancillary studies were separately funded that added performance-based measures of function. One of them was the National Institutes of Aging, doing a memory and movement study, and then the Look Ahead brain MRI study. The first one was 2009 to 2012, and then the brain MRI one was 2011 to 2014. These studies provided objective measures of physical function and cognition in over 1,000 participants. They did MRIs on 319 people. The post-intervention observational phase of Look Ahead has focused increasingly on issues of greatest relevance to aging population with overweight, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. That was not their original intention. They wanted to see people of all ages with overweight and obesity with type 2 diabetes. But they found, oh, we can't really find anything in the general population, younger population, so let's focus on the old geezers that we know have some health outcomes happening to them because they're at that point in their life. Let me skip down a little bit because I want to get into the methods of the study. So, the participants in the study were recruited at 16 clinical sites within the United States. Major eligibility criteria included they had to be between the ages of 45 to 76. They needed to have a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. Their BMI needed to be greater than 25 and greater than 27 if they were on taking insulin. They needed to be able to complete a maximal exercise test and have a primary care provider. Okay? A total of 5,145 participants entered the trial. 59% of them were women, 37% from racial ethnic minority groups. Of the original 5,145 enrollees, 638 of them died during the study. 590 were no longer being followed by the end of the study. The cohort continues to have similar gender and racial ethnic distribution to the original. So they had fall off because of death and people basically dropping out, but the percentages as it relates to the breakdown of men and women and ethnicity stayed basically the same. All right, so what were the interventions? Participants were randomly assigned to either this low-calorie and exercise program as the intervention or the control group. The goal of the intervention was to produce and maintain a mean 7% weight loss. Here's how they did it. By reducing calorie intake. They wanted to get a goal of 1,200 to 1,800 calories a day, which I've heard some much more extreme, especially in studies, low-calorie diets. So this one's not horrible at face value, although I think 1,200 is on the low end. 1,800, and again, depending on the men or women, I'm assuming the 1,800 was more men and the 1,200 was more women, and that there was a mix in between. I don't think women per se need to go too much below 1,500 calories. Again, depending on age, depending on a lot of things. And then guys, 1,800 is pretty darn low for calories. Along with increasing their physical activity with a goal of 175 minutes a week of moderate intensity activity. So what is that? Almost 3 hours worth of exercise. It's not a lot. To achieve these changes, the intervention included both group and individual sessions with weekly sessions during months 1 through 6, and then they gradually decreased the contact. Contact remained at least monthly throughout. The intervention participants received 3 sessions a year, all focused on diet, exercise, and social support. All right, so the assessments. In-clinic assessments were held annually through the intervention phase of the study, but later were conducted every other year. In addition, participants were contacted by phone every 6 months throughout the entire study to assess their health outcomes. All assessments were conducted by certified staff who were masked to intervention assignment. In other words, they were blinded. They didn't know which one, whether they were in the control group or the intervention group. They just took the assessment of what was going on in their health. So what were the results? The effects of the intervention on its direct targets, weight and cardiovascular fitness. Remember, that was the primary outcome originally in the study. As noted here, the goal of the study was to produce a mean 7% weight loss through a combination of calorie reduction and increased physical activity, and significantly greater improvements in cardiovascular fitness than those in the control group. The study successfully achieved these goals. They may have successfully achieved the 7% reduction in weight, but let's not pretend that they reached their goal of better cardiovascular results than the control group when they were exactly the same. It kills me how they have to, but we achieved the goal. No, you didn't. Moreover, significant differences between arms for these intervention goals have been maintained over time. The weight losses through the intervention phase and the 2 years following the end of the intervention, the greatest weight loss occurred during the first year of the trial, which makes sense. You're going to lose the most weight when you first start. The intervention group achieved a mean weight loss of 8.5% at year 1. Remember, their goal was 7%, relative to a weight loss of 0.6% in the control group. So listen. The control group barely lost any weight at all, 0.6% compared with 8.5% during that same 1 year period for the intervention group. So they accomplished major weight loss to the tune of probably, what is that? 12 to 15 times the amount of weight loss of the control group. Although participants in the intervention group gradually regained weight. Anybody ask why? No. The differences in weight change for both groups remain statistically significant throughout the trial, which I think is wonderful in light of what happened with their cardiovascular risk. So it was still big enough that the weight loss, if that's what they were trying to prove, is if we get people to lose weight, it's going to improve their cardiovascular markers. That's what they were hoping would happen. For example, at year 8, the intervention group had lost a cumulative 4.7% of their initial weight, compared with just 2.1% on the control group. So when the intervention stopped in 2012, there was concern that the intervention participants would experience a weight gain after getting out of the study. Although they did regain more than the control group during the 2 years after the intervention ended, both groups experienced significant subsequent declines in weight during that post-intervention period. The intervention group had continued to have a greater percent weight loss from baseline relative to the control group, and these findings were unexpected because typically participants in a lifestyle intervention gradually regain weight over time and then go back to their baseline level. The continued weight loss in both groups raises questions regarding whether the weight losses occurred later in the trial in both arms are unintentional or perhaps related to illness. How do you tease that out? The only way you could is if you looked individually at each of the participants to see, all right, what were they going through that led to the weight loss? Was it because of an illness that was making them lose weight, or were they actually trying to lose weight through some kind of lifestyle change? The other goal of the intervention was to increase physical activity and improve the cardiovascular fitness level. The intervention participants achieved significantly greater improvements in fitness at both year 1, which saw a 20.9% improvement versus 5.79% in the control, and at 4 years, 5.4% for the intervention and a negative 0.83% for the control group. Again, they outpaced them in calorie restriction. They outpaced them, the intervention with the control, in physical activity. 2 of the parameters they were trying to show is going to improve cardiovascular markers. Again, the differences were greatest at year 1, significant effects maintained through 4 years when fitness testing was discontinued. Using walking speed as a proxy for fitness levels at 11 years after randomization, participants randomized to the intervention had faster gait speed over 4 and 400 m relative to those in the control group. That's just to say, you guys, they were more physically fit than the control group. That's going to come in handy here in a second when we see the cardiovascular outcomes. Let's get to that. As described here, the primary outcome for the look-ahead trial was a composite measure of cardiovascular disease events, including death from cardiovascular causes, non-fatal myocardial infarction, non-fatal stroke, and hospitalized angina. The study was stopped for futility after a median of almost 10 years of intervention, and it was apparent that the assignment to this intervention, remember, low calorie and exercising more, was associated with a non-significant hazard ratio relative to the control group. In other words, no difference. You know, that had to piss off the researchers. They had invested so much of their time and energy into showing that, gee, if you just lose a little weight, by cutting calories and moving your butt a little more like we've been telling people to do for decades, surely that's going to show an improvement in cardiovascular health. And then it didn't. It didn't. Why isn't this on the front page of the newspaper that people realize they've been lied to when it comes to nutritional health? It's not about eat less, move more. Maybe it's about something else. So they write in the paper, this result was unexpected and greatly disappointing to so many. Although one explanation, oh, this ought to be good. One explanation is that the intervention does not reduce cardiovascular mortality and morbidity in individuals with overweight and obesity with type 2 diabetes. Other post hoc explanations have been proposed for the failure to find a significant beneficial effect. Oh, let's see how they spin this one, you guys. Some of the reasons why this happened. Number one, look-ahead participants may have been too healthy, or alternatively, too ill in order to show any benefit. So, So, they're type 2 diabetic and obese at the beginning of the study, and they were considered too healthy? Nah. That doesn't explain why there was no difference between that and the control group. Come on. And they had type 2 diabetes, and they have obesity? No. Too ill to show any benefits? I mean, I suppose it's possible if someone was already kind of deep into the disease state and you're only cutting their calories and making them move more. You're not actually healing their disease, which a low-carb ketogenic diet, by the way, would do that right away. Within like 30 to 60 days, you would see massive improvements in diabetes and obesity. They didn't do that. So maybe they were too ill to stay on that kind of a diet. Concern regarding the good health of the participants, that one cracks me up, was raised by the fact that passing a maximal cardiovascular stress test was included as part of the eligibility criteria. Well, come on. You could still be very unhealthy and pass a stress test. When I was 410 pounds back in 2003, I took a stress test because I was having some chest pains and things happening. And I took it, and I went to the maximal. Now, I was huffing and puffing and all the things, but I did it. I was able to do it. So was I too healthy? Hell no, I wasn't. Not even close. However, the opposite concern was also raised, that everyone in that cohort was too ill. Although the look-ahead cohort as a whole was relatively healthy, there was a subgroup of about 14% of the participants who had prior history of cardiovascular disease. The look-ahead trial had specifically focused on recruiting participants with a prior outcome for CVD. The trial found a non-significant intersection between the treatment arm and the occurrence of primary cardiovascular outcome. Participants who had no history had a somewhat lower hazard, blah, 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 blah. More recently, similar and statistical stronger evidence suggests that the beneficial effects of the intervention, again, eat less, move more, on cardiovascular disease were seen primarily in those participants who were healthiest at baseline, was obtained when the study examined the interaction between intervention group and a deficit accumulation frailty index called the Rockwood Frailty Index. This deficit is thought to be a more inclusive marker of age-related health than the CVD history. This is called, we were hoping to see cardiovascular benefits, but because we didn't, we have to kind of cover our ass a little bit and make up this bullshit excuse of it's about this Rockwood Frailty Index. I wish they would just be honest and say, wow, we learned something new in this intervention. We were wrong. The second explanation as to why they did not see improvements, let's look at that one, is that greater improvements in LDL-C, which is a part of your cholesterol panel, and the greater use of statin medications over time, particularly in the control group as related to the intervention group, may have blunted the effects that might have been seen with lifestyle interventions. Okay. So they're claiming that the control group, oh, they got the benefit of statin medications that made their LDL-C a lot better. But guys, we know, I wrote a whole book about it called Cholesterol Clarity. You can go check it out. LDLC is meaningless. So if LDLC is meaningless, what are they talking about? The only thing we know about statin medications that could be related to cardiovascular health is we know that they are anti-inflammatory. And so maybe they got some benefit of the anti-inflammatory effects of statin medications, and maybe by extension of that, that created this no difference between the cardiovascular risks. Look Ahead did not assume the medical care of participants in the trial, but allowed the participants' own physician to make a decision about medications. Well, yeah, doctors are always going to look at the lipids, the cholesterol panel, and they're going to base that cholesterol panel on whether they give them a medication or not. That's not surprising. Over the course of the study, the cohort increased their use of statins, also hypertensive agents, which is high blood pressure, and insulin. 80% were on statins from year 4 on. Moreover, the control group experienced significantly lower levels of LDL-C from years 3 to 7 of the intervention and had greater use of statins, medications for high blood pressure, and insulin. Okay, but you know that though. Why would you use that as an excuse? You're using it as an excuse because you're pissed off that you didn't see natural improvements with your intervention. You had the wrong intervention. Again, if you didn't focus so obsessively on calorie restriction and moving more, eat less, move more, and really focused on things that would have actually helped people with obesity and type 2 diabetes and it actually improved their cardiovascular health, like a ketogenic diet, you would have seen better results. The third explanation as to why they had this no change between the two groups was that the Look Ahead study did not produce large enough weight loss. They wanted them to lose 7% of their weight. They said, that's our target. They lost 8.5% of their weight. But now they're saying, well, we didn't see differences because it wasn't enough weight loss and they didn't increase their fitness enough to reduce the risk. Remember, the control group significantly different than the intervention group when it came to the weight loss and the physical activity. Significantly. They even stated it earlier in the study. Oh, it was still very statistically significant difference. They're pissed because they didn't get the statistically significant result that they wanted. I just find it funny that they can't admit our intervention sucked. We had a theory and it sucked. They can't admit that. They have to come up with excuses. This hypothesis received some report from a post hoc observational analysis comparing participants who had the greatest weight loss and the largest improvement in fitness during the first year of the intervention relative to those with the poorest weight loss and least improvements in fitness. Using this on-protocol approach, we found evidence that those participants who had the greatest weight loss in year 1 had significantly lower risk of the primary outcome of CVD risk. Okay. So they're teasing out individual study participants that, see, they lost more weight. See, they physically did more activity. Therefore, we assume because that happened for them and they had the lowest CVD risk, had we gotten them all to do that much, blah, 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 blah. What I want to know is what made them think 7% weight loss was a target that was a worthy target. They just made it up. I assume they did something that told them that that would be a good target. Okay, so let's take a look at the secondary outcomes. Remember, the primary outcome was weight loss, trying to hit that 7%, they'd hit it, and then cardiovascular risk markers, and it was basically no different from the control group. So what were the secondary outcomes? Glycemic control and the remission of diabetes on a Eat Less, Move More plan. Let's listen. As noted here, participants reported having had diabetes for a median, an average of 5 years when they entered the trial. 16% of them were using insulin, and their average A1C level, 7.3. In parallel with the weight losses described previously, The intervention trial group had the most dramatic changes in their A1C at 1 year relative to the control group, but the differences were still significant even at years 4, 6, and 10. So they lowered their A1C. Of particular note is the intervention participants were more likely to experience a partial or complete remission of their diabetes, transitioning to pre-diabetes or non-diabetic levels of glycemia. 11.5% of the participants had remission by year 1, 7.3% by year 4, relative to the control group, which was just 2% over that same period of time. In parallel with the A1C data, the highest rates of remission occurred in year 1. Remission at 1 year was greatest for those in the intervention group who had more than 2 years of diabetes, had low baseline BMI, had a low initial A1C level, were not taking insulin, and in those who had lost the most weight. So they're just saying, okay, our superstar participants in the intervention group, they went into remission with their diabetes. These positive effects of the intervention need to be considered along with concerns regarding the potential of intervention to increase the risk of hypoglycemia. In order to lower the risk of hypoglycemia during the initial period, the Look Ahead study developed an algorithm for adjusting insulin and other diabetes medications in those participants in the intervention group. I would like to know, wouldn't they want to try to get them off of medications, because it does kind of skew the data if you're adjusting medications to the thing that you're doing? Doesn't that skew the data? So you're not actually looking at an eat less, move more. You're basically looking at eat less, move more with adjusted medications depending on what that eat less, move more is doing to your diabetes. Because we know the powerfulness of the drugs for diabetes. We know insulin will work to lower your blood sugar, which will then make the A1C look good. But did you get healthier? We know that's not true. So there's a lot of questions with this study. Despite the use of the algorithm and the reductions in insulin, the intervention participants still had a greater risk of severe hypoglycemia than those in the control group during year 1, although this difference was not apparent later in the intervention. Well, hypoglycemia is a direct result of you're eating too many carbs, and it's kind of up and down in your blood sugar. All right, let's look at other secondary outcomes. Let's look at nephropathy and neuropathy. It did not include any measurements of retinopathy. It did assess nephropathy and neuropathy and showed positive changes with the intervention group on both complications that are associated with type 2 diabetes. Nephropathy is a major cause of morbidity and is associated with cardiovascular mortality among individuals with diabetes. It is well known that improving glycemic control reduces this risk, but the effect of lifestyle interventions, as well as in particular weight loss, has received much less attention. So in this study, they analyzed incidence of very high-risk chronic kidney disease, and they found that the intervention led to a significant reduction in the incidence of CKD. I'm trying to see if there's anything. Oh, and then the neuropathy was by self-report and objective testing, although scores on this were similar in both groups at baseline. At year 1, when weight loss was maximal, the mean scores were basically the same again, so no real difference between those two interventions. How about depressive symptoms and quality of life? Both diabetes and obesity independently increase your risk of depression and poor quality of life, because depression in individuals with diabetes is associated with less active self-management, hyperglycemia, higher rates of diabetes, and greater healthcare costs. The effects of the intervention on depression are important clinical issues. Analyzing the incidence of mild or greater depressive symptoms using the Beck Depressive Inventory Score. Amongst those with such symptoms at baseline, we found that the intervention was on average 15% less likely than those in the control group to progress to symptoms of mild or greater depression. There was also marked difference in the scores for those in the intervention versus control in the cohort as a whole, with the greatest benefits during year 1, in which those who had lowest levels of depression at baseline. There was no difference between the two groups in the proportion of participants on antidepressant medications. So they also did this physical function component of the medical outcomes study short form, administered annually to all participants. It reported that the intervention group was successful in improving physical related quality of life. As with many other secondary outcomes, the benefits relative to the control were strongest in the first year, although both participants with and without any history of cardiovascular disease at baseline benefited initially from the intervention. Only those who did not have a history of cardiovascular disease at baseline had benefit following year 2 and all follow-up. In contrast, there was no significant effects of the intervention seen on mental health related quality of life. That's fascinating. We also know nutrition plays a role in your cognitive health, your depression, your quality of life. Look ahead needs to look behind and see there was something better. Hopefully they learned the lessons from this, that this was a failure. How about sleep apnea? Sleep apnea is common in individuals with obesity, increases in prevalence with aging, and associated with insulin resistance and glucose metabolism. In the sleep ahead, or in the, they did a sleep ahead ancillary study. There were 306 of the participants in the look ahead study that underwent what's called a polysomnography. I'll get it out in a minute. At baseline, a high proportion of the participants, 86.6% of them, were found to have an undiagnosed sleep apnea. 22.6% had severe obstructive sleep apnea. Each unit increase in BMI correlated with a 10% increase in the odds of this severe version. After 1 year on the intervention, the apnea hypopnea index had decreased by 9.7% compared to the control group. In addition, more than 3 times as many participants in the intervention had total remission than those in the control group. So they got improvement from sleep apnea, which if it's related to glycemic control, again, low-carb ketogenic would have been even better. How about healthcare use and costs? Separately, both diabetes and obesity will increase your medical care costs, and the coexistence further increases your costs, although it's been suggested that lifestyle intervention to promote weight loss and physical activity may reduce healthcare costs. There have been no long-term studies that have looked at this. Because the intervention reduced weight, improved glycemic control and physical fitness, and reduced microvascular complication, we hypothesized that this intervention would reduce the use of medication, hospitalization, consequently may affect the healthcare use and spending. So they took a look at all the participants, they did interviews with them, hospital records, medication inventory over 10 years. They reported that the intervention group reduced their annual hospitalization by 11%, of the days in the hospital by 15%, medication use by 7%. Can I tell you how paltry that is? If the intervention, which is supposed to be the bee's knees of making them healthier, only produced 11% reduction in hospitalization, 7% reduction in medication, 15% less days in the hospital, that's not good. I mean, it's better than what they had, I suppose, but let's not pretend like that is a huge accomplishment. As a result of the differences, the intervention produced a mean 10-year cost savings. Over 10 years, they saved a little over $5,000 a patient. That's $500 a year. If you've ever gotten a medical bill from a hospital, $500 is one test. Let's get real here. That's not that great. Interestingly, these beneficial effects of the intervention were not seen in those with a history of CVD. It's not interesting, it's predictable. I love how they're trying to put a positive spin on a crappy result, and they can't. You can't shine a turd if it's still a turd. It's still a turd, and it stinks. These cost savings should be considered in combination, blah, 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 blah. All right, cancer. There's been no clinical trials to evaluate the effects of the intervention for weight loss on cancer. Look ahead. Recently examined the incidence of cancer through the first 12 years of follow-up. 684 participants, 332 in the intervention, 352 in the control had been diagnosed with cancer. The incidence rates of obesity-related cancers were 6.1 and 7.3 per 1,000 persons in both groups. There was no significant difference between the two groups in total cancer incidence. So, despite it being an intervention that is supposed to make them healthier, they had no different cancer incidence than the control group, which again should beg the question, why? Why? If eat less, move more is supposed to be the be-all, end-all for your health, why did they get just as much cancer as those who were not doing that? Also, the incidence of non-obesity related cancer, no difference. Total cancer mortality, in other words, people dying because of cancer, no difference. It was also no difference between the genders. In other words, it's as if there was no intervention at all. Let this serve as a warning that if somebody says, well, you just need to eat less and move more. Oh yeah, it's better. It's better than what? Like there's no studies. Tell them about the look ahead study. All right, so body composition changes. I mean, sure, they lost some body composition. Body fat loss. Yeah, that's not even worth looking at. I mean, it's obvious they lost weight compared with the control group. We know that. Physical function, same thing. Fractures, so this is a frailty score. We've shown adverse effects of the intervention on the risk of frailty. Older individuals with diabetes are known to have an increased risk of fractures. Weight loss also increases the risk. Therefore, we've been very interested in the effects of the intervention on the outcome. Fractures were assessed by self-report at 6-month intervals. Both groups did not differ in their total number of fractures. In other words, just like the cancer, just as many got fractures in both the intervention group as well as the control group. Crazy. The risk for hip fracture was elevated in the intervention group, but this finding was not statistically significant with a very large number of people, because hip fractures can result in substantial morbidity and increased mortality. Look ahead, we'll continue to follow this outcome. So they look at some of the geriatric syndromes, which again, this was an older population. Remember, they originally were looking at everybody. Then later on in the study, they're like, well, we're not getting the results we need, so let's just look at the old people and see what happens. And it still wasn't any better. They've got things about multimorbidity, disability, brain structure. Well, we're going to skip some of that because I want to get to the end of the study where they conclude what they find in the study, because this was not what they expected. Look Ahead provides the largest, longest study of the effects of Eat Less, Move More on the health of middle-aged individuals with type 2 diabetes and overweight obesity. The study has clearly shown that 1, it is possible to produce long-term weight loss and improve levels of physical fitness in these individuals. Yeah, but to what end? Yeah, you found weight loss and you got physical fitness levels, but to what end? Because they're dying the same, they're getting cancer, they're getting frail just like everybody else. If the point is to make them healthier, don't you want to see some statistically different results from the control group? And they did not. 2, there were many beneficial effects of the lifestyle intervention on health parameters. No, there weren't. 3, in contrast, the only overall adverse health effect of the intervention relative to the control was the frailty fractures. No, that was not the only one. 4, for many important health outcomes, there was no significant differences between the groups, and that's not something to celebrate. If there was no difference, what was the point of the trial? The point of the trial was to say, eat less, move more is better for you. It is not. very clearly. And on several of the parameters, post hoc analysis suggests there were subgroups that benefited while others had no benefit or perhaps even negative effects. As noted earlier, the goal of the intervention was to reduce body weight through behavior intervention focused on eat less, move more. Look ahead showed that the lifestyle intervention was effective in producing differences in body weight between these groups. These differences were marked after 1 year, and they persisted long term, which makes this study all the more depressing for the researchers. They got what they wanted as far as the intervention doing what it needed to do. It just didn't show the results that they wanted it to. The benefits of the intervention were substantial. There were negative effects, though, from the intervention, particularly on lean body mass and frailty, and some important health domains in which no differences have yet emerged, including overall rates of cardiovascular disease, cancer, cognition, and cognitive impairment. Further follow-up will be critical to determine the long-term effects of this intervention on these parameters. Newsflash, if you haven't paid attention to what you've found so far, why would you think, if you haven't seen a lot of statistical differences between the intervention, Eat Less, Move More, and the control group, if you haven't seen a lot of differences between the two groups up until now, what, pray tell, makes you think you're going to see some statistical difference later on as you continue following these people? Admit it. This was an abysmal failure of the Eat Less, Move More. Look Ahead has continued on as an observational study, gradually increased its focus on outcomes related to aging because, well, number one, the population of the people in it are aging. But number two, you saw no benefits of the middle-aged people that were there at the beginning of the study. It's worth remembering that the original impetus came from observational studies, blah, blah, blah. We talked about that earlier. So based on these findings from the Look Ahead study, should individuals with type 2 diabetes who have overweight or obesity be encouraged to lose weight? Well, I don't think it has anything to do with weight loss at all. If you get them on a healthy diet and lifestyle plan and a proper movement plan and getting them fresh air and sunshine and all these things, meditation practices, you would see a lot better outcomes than this Look Ahead study. Given the large number of outcomes that were positively impacted, none, relative to the small number of actual negative effects, lots, it would seem prudent that we need to recommend weight loss. No, you need to recommend something that's actually going to make them healthier. Maybe figure out why there's such frailty in the bones. Gee, I don't know. Cutting calories and moving more without giving them proper nutrients to build those bones and build them stronger, which, by the way, a ketogenic diet has lots of evidence that it's very good for your bone health, very good for your preserving muscle. They missed the boat on this, guys, and they can't even admit it in this paper, reviewing and looking at the history of this study. There was no overall difference between the groups on several critical outcomes, including cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, cognitive function, cognitive impairment, cancer, and more. It all raises concern about the level of enthusiasm for this recommendation of Eat Less, Move More to get healthy. No kidding! Further observational follow-up and attention to long-term outcomes, including mortality and healthcare costs, and to adjudicated cases of dementia are clearly warranted. Moreover, given the heterogeneity in outcomes suggested by this analysis, it would seem best to recommend the intervention early in the course of diabetes, when individuals are younger, hopefully have less obesity, and before they developed other comorbidities. Early intervention could help. No, I don't think early intervention would have helped this at all. I think what this study shows is, verifiably, knock, 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 in the coffin, is the Eat Less, Move More concept. Been hammered down our throats for years, and now we have a study. Tell people about the Look Ahead randomized trial. It showed horrible, horrible results. Lowered lean mass, more fragile measures, no cardiovascular benefit, And meanwhile, there are good studies looking at ketogenic diets. If you look at the study from Virta Health, VIRTA, they show incredible benefits after 2 years of a ketogenic approach. So, hope that clarifies that eat less, move more is a bunch of bunk. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening and watching here on the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Again, go follow Jimmy Makes Science Simple over on Instagram, and we'll be back again with another study for you real soon. Bye, guys.